This is Nauru, the smallest island nation in the world, a floating driblet of rock, 1/10 the size of Washington. 50 years ago, it was one of the wealthiest nations in the world due to its rich phosphate mines. People would go into a shop, buy a few sweets, pay with a $50 note, and not take the change. They'd use money as toilet paper, but today it has an unemployment rate of about 90%. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. The year is 1798, and the world is still largely uncharted territory. The British ship Snow Hunter is on a voyage to the China Seas. Suddenly on November 8th, they spot an island that no European had ever laid eyes on before. The captain of the ship, John Fearn, did not permit his men to leave the ship, and nor did any Nauruans boarded the ship. Still, the welcome charmed the captain. He was so taken with the island's green central plateau, waving palms, and white sand beaches that he named it Pleasant Island. During the 1830s, John Jones, a fugitive from Norfolk Island, had ruled the Nauruan beaches with brutality, murdering at least a dozen beachcombers. He stayed on the edges of Nauruan society, brokering deals with passing ships to trade pigs and coconuts for tobacco, liquor, and rifles. Eventually, Jones fell out with the Nauruan chiefs, and in 1841 they exiled him to Banaba. During the 1870s, firearms became prevalent in households throughout the island, and the residents were smoking and drinking heavily. Nauru began to descend into violence after a chief was shot and killed during a drunken quarrel. This went on for a few years. Then one day in 1899, the geologist Albert Ellis inspected a rock-like object found in the island. He had been told it was a piece of petrified wood, but this did not seem right to Ellis, and soon discovered that it was actually high-grade phosphate ore, a super fertilizer worth a potential fortune if he could locate the source. Sailing to Nauru in 1901, Ellis found that 80% of the entire island was rich in phosphate. The Pacific Islands Company was renamed to Pacific Phosphate Company, and in 1905, a deal was made with Germany to mine Nauru. This would export hundreds of thousands of tons of phosphate. By the early 1920s, Nauru was exporting 200,000 metric tons of phosphate a year. And 2 decades later, it was more than 4 times that. Phosphate mining eventually stopped after Japan invaded Nauru in 1942. Japanese troops were merciless, and when the war ended in 1945, fewer than 600 Nauruans remained on the island. The United Nations put Nauru under a trusteeship of 3 countries, with Australia once again administering the island. The phosphate industry was almost immediately revived, and a few years later exports were higher than ever. By the time Nauru gained independence in 1968, more than 35 million metric tons of phosphate had already been exported. By 1968, 1/3 of Nauru had been mined, and Nauruans were living on a narrow ring around a plateau of jagged coral and limestone pillars. After independence, the Republic of Nauru chose to cash in its remaining phosphate, increasing exports despite knowing that supplies would run out within a generation or two. In 1975, Nauru's Phosphate Royalties Trust was valued at well over $1 billion, and the country's per capita gross domestic product was second only to Saudi Arabia. Most Nauruans certainly did not live in luxury, but the government did not tax incomes, provided free education and health care, and was the main employer for Nauruans. The government also bought cruise ships, aircraft, and overseas hotels, while politicians chartered flights to shop and vacation abroad. Trying to diversify the economy before phosphate supplies ran out, Nauru turned to offshore banking, licensing around 400 foreign banks by the early 1990s. By the mid-1990s, Nauru was also offering economic citizenship by selling Nauruan passports with little inspection. The Nauruan government did earn millions of dollars a year in fees, but these schemes turned the island into a safe place for tax evasion and money laundering. Even offshore banking and selling passports could not fix Nauru's economic crisis. Desperate for revenue and jobs, with cruel intentions, Nauru agreed in 2001 to allow Australia to establish a detention center on the island to process asylum seekers who'd been trying to reach Australia by boat. Even this scheme could not patch the gaping hole in Nauru's economy as primary phosphate reserves ran out. In 2000, Nauru did manage to export another 500,000 metric tons, but by 2004, Nauru's phosphate boom was truly over, with exports tallying just 22,000 metric tons. In 2005, phosphate exports fell to a record low of 8,000 metric tons. Nauru had been under intense international pressure to stop money laundering and the granting of economic citizenship. The US government even went as far as using the 2001 Patriot Act. Today, Nauru is still searching for a place in the world economy. Since 2006, it has upgraded mining equipment and refurbished mining infrastructure to dig out harder to reach phosphate. But its phosphate industry, mining around 45,000 metric tons a year, is producing nothing like in the past. Nauru does have secondary reserves of phosphate, perhaps as much as 20 million metric tons. Plans are underway to mine this last remaining phosphate. But no one sees this as a long-term solution for its economic troubles.